do the introduction to photosynthesis and cellular respiration. One of the main standards is to understand how photosynthesis and cellular respiration coexist and how they depend on each other. So we're going to take a look at the big picture in this set of slides, and then you'll have to click on either the photosynthesis or the cell respiration slides to get a better close-up view. First of all, both of these processes are called biochemical pathways. And one thing that you have to understand, even though we're not going to go into all of the things, this is a long chain of chemical reactions. If you imagine a worldwide domino competition where people would spend weeks setting up dominoes to then go and knock them over, this is along the lines of what we're talking about. It is an extremely complex and impressive array of possibilities that goes from one chemical reaction to the next. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time going into each and every chemical reaction, but just know that this is a very large, in the sense that it encompasses many chemicals, many chemical reactions, and it's actually quite impressive. So again, we're just going to look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and even as we skim the surface of these two, understand that there is a whole set of chemical reactions going on that we're not even going to mention. So here's the big picture. This is the big picture that you've been looking at since 3rd grade. Animals, such as cows and people and dogs and cats and all those cute little critters you loved in 3rd grade, depend on the plant life around us, not just for the food that we eat, which it's showing here, and the food that we get from plants are the carbohydrates, which we break down and use to produce ATP. So we're getting energy from the food that comes ultimately from plants, right? We're also getting oxygen that the plants produce. So we're getting lots of food in the form of carbohydrates, sugar molecules that the plants created. We're also using oxygen that is a byproduct that plants don't need and they release into the atmosphere. So where do the plants get these things? They get these things through the process of photosynthesis, which is the first one that we'll talk about. Photosynthesis takes place in every green leaf and stem out there. The green coloring is due to the pigment chlorophyll. And the pigment chlorophyll, what it does is it takes in sunlight and it enables the plant to use the energy in that sunlight to create sugar. A byproduct of creating this sugar is oxygen. So as the plant goes through the process of photosynthesis, this tree here and the grass, it produces oxygen. We take in that oxygen, and the oxygen, in combination with the carbohydrates that we consume from plants, we convert that into a mass amount of ATP, or energy, in order to run our bodies. There's the red lines here. In order to make carbohydrates, plants need lots of carbon, right? Carbohydrates. And the plant takes in carbon dioxide, and it uses that carbon to make the sugars, the carbohydrates. Also, another way that animals benefit the plants, it's not just providing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but when this cow takes a poop, or defecates if you like the scientific word, the nitrogen and other minerals that are in that poop will be broken down by decomposers, and all those nitrates and nitrites will be returned to the soil where the plant can take them up and use them to grow. So in this system, the plants depend on us and we depend on them. So again, this was the big third grade picture. I've put a line here. This is the photosynthesis half of the process. This is the cellular respiration half of the process. Now, one thing that I want to make very clear, plants do cellular respiration as well. The sunlight gives them energy to make those carbohydrates. But just like animal cells, plant cells must be able to break those carbohydrates down and turn them into ATP. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, and you may have even heard in the past that plant cells don't have mitochondria, but they do. So even though we draw this diagram and we say plants do photosynthesis and animals do cellular respiration, that's a little bit incorrect because these plants must do cellular respiration as well in order to generate the ATP they need from the carbohydrates they make. Alright, enough of that. Let's get an overview of photosynthesis. There are two main stages, and while this diagram may look daunting, it's really not that bad. We have two cycles. The first one is on the left-hand side, and it's right here, and these are called the light reactions or the light cycle. On the right-hand side, we have the Calvin cycle, sometimes called the dark reactions. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, this little bean-shaped organelle is the chloroplast. And the chloroplast houses chlorophyll. So if you've looked at a plant cell under a microscope, which I know you have if you've been in my class, the cells that have all the little green organelles in them, the little green organelles are the chloroplasts. Inside you have chlorophyll that makes them green, and that's where the light is actually captured. So inside the chloroplast, which is located in every green leaf and stem, inside the chloroplast is where these processes happen. So the light cycle obviously uses sunlight, so here comes the sunlight. It also needs water, so here's H2O. Plants have to take up water through their roots, just like you and I have to drink water. So here's the water, and the water and sunlight combine in these stacks of grana. And this is where part of that biochemical pathway happens. It's called photosystem 2, electron transport chain, and photosystem 1. We will not be going into depth with those because it's a bunch of chemistry that you'll probably not remember anyway. So here's what you need to know about the light reactions. Light and water combine in the chloroplast, and light provides energy to transform that water into oxygen, O2 down here, and then ATP and NADPH. This is why photosynthesis is somewhat of a cycle. If you notice, these two molecules go round and round and round. And what's happening is NADP and ADP are used along with the water and the energy from the sunlight to create ATP and NADPH. The whole reason the light reactions exist is to harness that light energy and create ATP. Notice that it looks like a little starburst because ATP is an energy molecule. And in order to make the sugar, right here, see the sucrose? In order to make the sugar, ATP and NADPH are necessary. Well, how are we going to make those? And the only way to make ATP is to harness the energy from the sunlight. So These molecules cycle around and around and around. If you want to imagine them as like a claw in a factory that picks up something, carries it somewhere else, drops it, and then it returns to do the same job over and over and over again, you can. The names of these molecules are not so important except for ATP. You should be familiar with that one. So then we go on to the Calvin cycle, which is over here, because we've used water and sunlight to make our ATP and our NADPH, our energy molecules. A byproduct of that has been oxygen. Okay, so that's where our oxygen comes from. So now our ATP and our NADPH, our energy molecules, are going to enter the Calvin cycle. And you can even see this one's a nice little cyclical looking diagram because it's going to go around and around and around. In the Calvin cycle, this is where the carbon dioxide is used. So we have ATP, NADPH, and carbon dioxide. These three things enter the Calvin cycle. It turns 3 times, which is kind of weird, but and it's used to make glucose and other simple sugars. And you know from our macromolecule studies that these monomers of carbohydrates, these monosaccharides, can be hooked together in a variety of ways to create other more complex carbohydrates. So it all starts here with photosynthesis. One misconception, a huge misconception, and one that they may ask you about, is that the carbon dioxide here is actually used to make sugar. The carbon dioxide, even though it has a little O2 here, has nothing to do with the oxygen that's produced. The oxygen is released long before the Calvin cycle even starts going, and it's not part of that cycle at all. The only thing that's released from the Calvin cycle is the end product, the sugar. Alright, that's basically it for the light cycle. We'll go into, in the Calvin cycle, we'll go into a little bit more depth on the screencast for just photosynthesis. An overview of cellular respiration. We have 2 stages of cell respiration, and you can do just one, or you can do both. The first stage, which is what every organism does, is called glycolysis. And glycolysis takes that glucose, right here it is in our diagram, here's our little blue box for glycolysis. The glucose that was made by the plant and then consumed, it takes that glucose and turns it into another molecule, pyruvate. This chemical process actually gives us some ATP. It's not a whole lot, but it's some. And this is where many organisms stop. This is called anaerobic respiration because there's no oxygen involved here, right? No oxygen. So our glucose is turned into pyruvate, and we get a couple of ATP molecules. For single-celled organisms, this is enough ATP. If you're a little bacteria floating around, you don't need mass amounts of ATP. So glycolysis is enough. Now, if you're a more complex organism and you need oxygen in order to survive, like most animals do, you're going to take this pyruvate, move it into your mitochondria, which is what this yellow bean-looking thing here is. Remember, we studied our organelles. The mitochondria is the power plant of the cell, so here's how it makes all that power. It takes the pyruvate, moves it into the mitochondria, where it goes through the Krebs cycle. Again, we're not going to study in depth the Krebs cycle, but it is there. The Krebs cycle produces a small amount of ATP. The Krebs cycle also produces carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. Kind of cool, huh? The Krebs cycle then donates electrons to the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is where this ATP synthase makes lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of ATP. This is where the oxygen is needed. This is the aerobic respiration. So in the mitochondria, we're using oxygen and the oxygen goes in with the electron transport chain along with the pyruvate and the electrons to produce lots of ATP. So there are two main parts of cell respiration. The anaerobic part, which does not require oxygen, and it's here, glycolysis. And the aerobic part that does require oxygen, which is here and occurs in the mitochondria. Now, glycolysis occurs in the cytosol or the cytoplasm, however you want to say it. And even bacteria have the cytosol or cytoplasm, so they have no problem doing this chemical reaction. The mitochondria is a membrane-bound organelle, which means bacteria don't even have mitochondria. So this is all they can do. And it produces enough ATP that it's sufficient for their needs. Larger organisms, though, need more ATP. So the mitochondria takes in the pyruvate and oxygen, puts it through the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain, and you end up with lots and lots of ATP. And that's it. Look up the notes on photosynthesis and cell respiration if you need to.